All right, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. You are currently in web room number 4, and our first presentation of the day is Invasive Phagmites Control Efforts in Minnesota. If you have questions for our presenters at any point during this talk, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You may need to hover your mouse at the bottom of the window for it to pop up. As a quick reminder, this presentation and all of the presentations today are being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube after the showcase. So if you missed something during the presentation, please don't worry. We will send out the links to all attendees after today. Without further ado from me, I'm going to hand it over to our presenters, Dan Larkin and Julia Bohnen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dan Larkin. I'm an associate professor and extension specialist in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology. I've been working on Phragmites for several years, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Julia Bohnen, who's going to start off and do the bulk of our presentation.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Julia Bohnen, a researcher at the University of Minnesota, and have been working on invasive Phragmites in Minnesota since 2017. So Dan and I are pretty excited to update you on what's going on in all things frag here in Minnesota. Let me advance. So I'm going to start today with an introduction to invasive Phragmites, talk about its current distribution and our statewide control effort. And then we'll give you an update on what's going on with wastewater treatment facilities as well. And then we have 2 new research projects that we'd like to introduce you to. So evaluating native Phragmites for wastewater treatment reed beds, and then comparing the performance of hybrid invasive and native Phragmites. So if you're not already familiar with invasive Phragmites, this is it. It's a very tall wetland grass growing to 15 or more feet tall. And if you were to drive down the roadside and see this, hopefully it would kind of catch your attention because it's something kind of new and unusual in Minnesota. This is one of the larger patches in Candy-Ojai County, but I don't know if you noticed, but there's a guy standing in there and he's 6 feet tall. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what we're working with. This is one of the taller patches for sure. They're not all this tall, but invasive Phragmites is known in Minnesota as a cryptic invader because we do have native Phragmites as well. Native Phragmites in Minnesota is very widespread and quite common, and it does occur in very large acreages. So in some of our native wetlands. So invasive Phragmites then is cryptic because it looks very much like the native Phragmites and is difficult, sometimes at minimum tricky to distinguish. You have to use particular characteristics to be able to tell them apart sometimes. So we want to be really careful that we do separate these 2 similar species, because we don't want to be treating the native Phragmites in our native wetlands and impacting those. We want to direct our efforts solely to the invasive Phragmites. In 2021, just this past winter, invasive Phragmites was elevated from a restricted noxious weed to a prohibited noxious weed on the control list. So that gives us a little bit of leverage in doing treatments. Invasive Phragmites has many impacts, so both ecological and economic impacts. So one of the ecological impacts is that, like many other invasive species, it reduces plant community diversity. One of the things that we're particularly concerned about in some of our native wetlands is that it should get into wild rice habitat and impact an already kind of struggling species. Also, it degrades wildlife habitat, both nesting and breeding habitat for several species, because it occupies wetlands along lake shores, in open grassy marshes, or riverine habitats. It can impact the nesting and breeding habitat for breeding birds, amphibians, as well as fish. So those are some of its ecological impacts. It also has economic impacts, impacting transportation, stormwater, and agricultural infrastructure. Along transportation corridors, it can impact sightlines because you saw how tall it was, and it will grow up out of those ditch places where it's wet and soggy, and it'll grow up the shoulder of the road and towards the road. And so this is potentially going to cause more impact costs for the highways to be maintained while they maintain their sight lines. And I did see one image where it was growing up through a crack in a road. So it does have the potential also to impact the road surfaces. So it also can impact stormwater infrastructure. It would grows into many stormwater systems, and we've seen this, large number of stormwater ponds around the metro area. And it would have the effect of filling those stormwater ponds and not then allowing them to store as much stormwater as they had been designed to, which could increase the impacts of flooding. And related to agricultural infrastructure, if it gets into agricultural drainage ditches, those drainage ditches would not be able to move water off the landscape like they're designed to do. And so agricultural crop production could be impacted by that. And then there are the impacts to lakes, wetlands, and rivers that are used for recreational purposes, as pretty much all the wetlands, lakes, and rivers in Minnesota are. And that's an important part of our economy here. So you can kind of imagine the impacts when those get, if those were to be infested with invasive Phragmites. Access for boaters, fishermen, hunters, and other wildlife observers would all be impacted. And then just broadly, it would have the potential to reduce property values of lands that it is invaded. So right now in Minnesota, we have somewhat more than 780 documented populations. You'll note that in September 2019, when I last gave an update to the MASERC showcase, we only had 435 verified populations. So that number has increased quite a bit. Some of that is certainly due to just more people being aware of it and reporting it. So increased reporting. But then also we certainly we know that it is increasing in the state as well. Some of the populations we're finding are small little starter populations that are moving along road corridors and things like that. You'll see from the distribution map that the distribution is kind of the same pattern as it was in 2019, where we have scattered populations in outstate Minnesota. We have picked up a few new additional populations out in outstate Minnesota, but I'd say that the bulk of the new populations that we're finding are concentrated more in the metropolitan area. And there's a few counties, St. Louis County, which has its little blob of 70 or so populations, but you can see those are in the Duluth Harbor area, and most of those have been treated. Then we have a couple of counties like Chisago and Wright County, where the numbers have increased quite a bit too. Prior to 2021, about 258 of those 435 populations have been treated. And we're right in the middle of our treatment season now. So we started the beginning of this month. And to date, we've treated about a third of the populations out of the 780 some. So we're making good progress, I think. And we have a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks left in our treatment window before we get shut down by a hard frost sometime in early October or mid-October. So we anticipate that we'll get quite a bit more treated before our 2021 treatment window is shut down on us. A few populations have been determined to be eliminated, and I use eliminated kind of loosely. We would not say that anything was completely eradicated or eliminated until it had been monitored for 3 to 4 years and we didn't find any regrowth. So there have been, when I say eliminated now, that means that a population was visited either by someone monitoring it or by a contractor, and they didn't find anything that needed to be treated this year. So we do have some populations where we appear to be having some success. So that's good news. We have a lot of partners working with us on this monitoring and control effort. I'm working with Wendy Kroll from Minnesota DNR, and we are working with funds from the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Those are being used throughout the state on both private and public lands to do control. But we have a lot of partners that are coordinating their own control efforts, and we're kind of keeping tabs on what's going on all around the state so that we can make sure everything gets documented and treated, and we're not leaving anything behind and not addressing it. But for example, out in Chisago County, the Lake Association out there and the Chisago LID are very active in doing control. The St. Croix River Association also has been involved in monitoring along the roadsides out there. Likewise, in White Bear Lake, the LID is coordinating control there. There's a coalition of metropolitan counties that are working with the Department of Ag grant and doing control on several of the populations throughout the metropolitan area. And then some counties just have other funding, whether it be MDA or their own streams of funding that they're using to do and coordinate their own treatments. The Duluth Stream Corps and Community Action Duluth up in St. Louis County are doing treatments and have obtained their own funding and are doing treatments and have done for the last several years in the Duluth Harbor area. And they've been able to expand into out and further into the county, St. Louis County up there. And then we have several agencies, MnDOT, DNR, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as some of the county highway departments like Rice and Aitkin County, for example, and some local municipalities that are coordinating their own treatment and reporting back to us and trying to keep tabs on what's going on out there too. And we do have a couple of private individuals. Usually it tends to be a farmer who we reported they had some on their property and they're like, oh, I can take care of that. I have the equipment and the means to do that. So we have a few private individuals working with us that way too. And then I certainly count all of our contractors as partners in this big effort as well. They're both doing monitoring and control while they're out and about. So this big statewide coordinated response couldn't happen if we didn't have these different streams of funding. So we're grateful for that. Department of Ag, GLI, and some additional funding. One of the things I think that is really important is that we have several point persons with the expertise and the time to coordinate this effort. So both being very knowledgeable about phragmites and then having the connections and networks and sometimes just the authority to do their job. And so, for example, some of the county ag inspectors, we would count as partners in this, and personnel from the soil and water conservation districts are working really closely with us on this and helping to coordinate and reach out to their constituents to help us out. And a lot of that help is with permitting, getting the permits to treat lakes, getting the permits to access somebody's property, et cetera. So that's been really important to have all the distributed expertise across the state to help us with those aspects of coordinating this effort. And then our contractors, we're getting, some contractors built up with some experience. We didn't have a lot of that obviously in Minnesota previously because we didn't have phragmites to control previously. So our contractors now gaining some experience, and some of them are tapping into some of the specialized equipment that they maybe had for treating invasive cattails, for example. And we're able to utilize some of that to get out and treat some of our trickier populations. And then we definitely are trying to incorporate treatment best practices. So we had a few incidences where contractors were not using the best timing, or they in fact used an herbicide that wouldn't be effective. So we're trying to be sure to communicate and get everybody on board with using the best practices to have the most efficient control. So one of the ways that phragmites has gotten out into the landscape is that it is being used as a green technology for wastewater treatment facilities. And when I say phragmites here too, both native and invasive phragmites are being used as this green technology in wastewater treatment facilities, but primarily in Minnesota, it's the invasive phragmites. But the invasive phragmites is valued for that because it has dense growth and high leaf area, and of course that massive height. It's very effective at dewatering biosolids via transpiration. And also when it's in the reed beds, it can really tolerate well the sedimentation that as the beds get loaded with the biosolids. So that would be as though we're in a floodplain and it was having sediment, washing over and accruing around it. And it's able to do that because it can root at the nodes along its stem. So as it gets loaded, it can continue to develop new roots up the stem. And these plants then allow the wastewater treatment facilities to store large volumes of biosolids, and that therefore decreases their biosolids management and handling costs. So it saves the municipalities quite a bit of money and allows them to operate pretty efficiently. So we have 17 wastewater treatment facilities in Minnesota that have reed beds, and 2 of those have always operated with native reeds. Those are the locations on the map with the blue spots. So Mora, for example, is only just literally in the last couple of years getting theirs established, but Avon is the other blue one, and they've been operating with the native reeds for quite a while now. 6 facilities, the yellow spots, have killed off their invasive reeds. Two of those, the spot up to the north in Aitken and the spot to the south in Mabel, haven't had invasive reeds for a long time now, for several years. The other four that just recently killed off the reeds in the last year or two. And that leaves us with 9 facilities that are continuing to operate with invasive reeds. And one of those, Richmond, which is the spot in the Middle West, out there by Avon, they plan to kill off their reeds yet this fall. So we'll be down to 8 facilities continuing to operate with invasive reeds now. The facilities that have removed their reeds, they'll operate using their beds as drying beds. So that means instead of transpiration, they'll just be relying on evaporation as well as subdrain to remove the water from the biosolids. And then facilities that are continuing to use the invasive reeds, what I'm hearing from them is that they want to wait until there's an alternative species before they transition away from the invasive reeds. And I think for some of those facilities, there are concerns that their facility would not operate effectively with the drying beds. So they need to have something in the reed beds to extra facilitate that evaporation and removal of water. I would note that for facilities that do want to transition away, we can offer them funding, or our grant funding can be used to treat the reed beds. But that's kind of a minor cost, I think, for some of the facilities as they consider, reinstalling some new plants or some other, implementing other technologies. So we do have a couple of research projects. This is one of them, evaluating native Phragmites then as an alternative for wastewater treatment use. And Robert Pennington is the graduate student working on that project, being advised by Dr. Waleed Sadak, in agronomy or crop sciences. And his research question asks, how does the water removal rate of native reeds compare to that of the invasive reeds? We assume it won't be as effective at doing that job, but we'd like to know, well, how close can we get? And we'll be able to measure that through the research that Robert's doing. So his goal will be to experimentally identify then the native strains that have high water removal capacity. And he's doing that by first selecting robust native populations. So those were identified largely by, if I got pulled off the highway when I was driving around looking for invasive Phragmites and I walked out through a wetland and I thought it might be invasive, but it turned out to be native, then that qualifies it as one of our robust native populations. And those populations were chosen from around the state so that hopefully there's some genetic diversity in the selection of species that he's evaluating. And he'll be using several parameters to measure water removal, and then looking at other plant traits, such as, for example, what is the length of the growing period for that particular population. So we know their growing period isn't as long as it is for invasive Phragmites, but we'd like to optimize that length of growing season. We're also looking at, simultaneous with his research, we're looking at how do we establish native Phragmites in the reed beds. So historically, the reed beds have been established using rhizomes, and that was fine when you were out digging up rhizomes from an invasive patch. But if we're going to transition to using our native Phragmites, we don't want to be disturbing our native wetlands in a way with taking a backhoe out there and putting holes in there, digging out rhizomes. But we do think that because they can establish shoots and roots from their stems along the nodes, we think that we can establish the beds using stems instead of rhizomes. This would minimize disturbance to the source wetlands, and it would be a lot easier and less time intensive to harvest them as well. So you could probably take like a brush saw or something out there and cut down a whole bunch of stems in a pretty short amount of time and gather them up. It would also minimize the introduction of undesirable species into the reed beds. So some of the reed beds, for example, the ones in northern Wisconsin, got reed canary grass in their rhizomes, and so that's now established in their beds. Cattails would be another species that might be established from either the seed on the rhizomes or seed on the rhizomes that you're installing, or even pieces of other rhizomes of other species that you don't want. So in the images here, that's a bundle of stems that we harvested from a wetland in Chanhassen. And in the second image, those stems are just installed on a tarp in a slurry of water and peat moss. And a few weeks later, they start to sprout and send up shoots and roots. And then in the third image to the right, these are the stems that were harvested in August that are actually installed in a reed bed down in the reed bed down in Montgomery. So they've been cooperating with us and letting us experiment in their reed beds where they've killed off their invasive reeds. And another thing that we're looking at, in addition to native Phragmites as an alternative, is how would other wetland species respond in a reed bed? We don't know if they would thrive there over time. So that's something that we can explore now while we are moving through this transition period. But we are looking at 8 different species. We kind of went down a whole list of things that might be possible, and then we picked the most optimal species that we thought might thrive in this kind of a setting. So we have 3 rushes, 3 grasses, a sedge, and a forb. And this is Keith Frederick in the picture on the left. And he's in a bed that's preloaded with biosolids. You can see he's kind of up to his knees, and we had difficulty maneuvering around in that bed to get things planted. The second picture is a bed that had been emptied out and they had not started to reload it. So it's just the remnants of the biosolids there. And we planted into that. And then in the third image, those beds were planted in May, and this image, the third image, is taken in August. And the winner so far is river bulrush. It's doing really well here and thriving in both beds under both starting conditions. This bed that was preloaded had more establishment of the species. There was a little bit less establishment in the bed that had not been preloaded. So we'll see if that continues to make a difference over time, and see how these species make it over winter, for example. We'll be monitoring that as well. And I'm going to turn the podium over to Dan now.
Thanks, Julia. So Julia's been talking about native Phragmites and non-native Phragmites. They're different lineages of the same species. So sort of a obvious question might be, can they hybridize? Julia, you're advanced.
Oh, yes, I have to help you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So native and non-native Phragmites remain genetically distinct in North America. They can be differentiated and by and large seem to have maintained their separation. But we know that they can be crossed in the greenhouse experimentally. So it's certainly biologically possible, but up until now, there have been few examples where hybrid Phragmites was found in the wild. And part of that may be that it's relatively rare, but it could also just be that we're not looking in the right places or using the right molecular markers. So, for example, there's been relatively little research in the upper Midwest or Great Lakes region, where we have both a lot of invasive Phragmites and still a lot of remnant native Phragmites. There are other parts of the country, especially the Atlantic coast, where the native Phragmites is virtually eliminated. So there's less opportunities for hybridization, and that's where a lot of the Phragmites research has happened. So we thought that Minnesota was really a suitable place to investigate whether hybridization was occurring, especially since through our MACERC research starting in 2017, we have the statewide mapping of native and non-native populations. So we partnered with some colleagues in the Department of Horticultural Science who had been doing genomic work on reed canary grass and other invasive species. And with funding from MACERC, we sort of adapted those tools for Phragmites using what's called a genotyping by sequencing approach. And there's a lot that went into this, but I'll just cut right to the punchline, which is that we found evidence of possible hybridization in about 4% of our statewide samples. And that's shown here on the map with potential hybrid populations being the pink diamonds. And one thing that was sort of a surprise to us, we thought it was likely that we would find hybrid Phragmites. We didn't think it would be so widely distributed around the state. So that is concerning. And this adds an additional challenge to Phragmites response efforts if we don't have a lack of clean separation between native and non-native. It's already hard enough when you have a native and a non-native subspecies. There's some work that needs to go into identifying them properly, and sometimes in the past that hasn't happened, and people have actually, sprayed native populations with herbicide, which is, bad and a waste of resources and detrimental to native vegetation. But the situation would get even more complicated with if there was widespread hybridization. And then also hybridization can give rise to greater invasiveness in invasive plant species, as for example with hybrid water milfoil, an AIS that we have in Minnesota. So there's also concern about kind of the ecology of the hybrids, and there's some evidence emerging from the Western US that there might be some advantages that hybrid Phragmites has with respect to its growth and performance and responses to herbicides. So given that we found that we do have hybrid Phragmites, an immediate question for us is, what is this hybrid Phragmites like? Is there hybrid vigor, and this might be a robust invasive Phragmites, or could it perhaps be a kind of a poorer performing hybrid offspring, as can happen as well? So master's student Janelle Balmaceda is working on this for her thesis and asking, does hybrid Phragmites exhibit hybrid vigor? What is its ecology and performance like? And related question, is it better equipped to take advantage of eutrophication or increase in nutrients? There's been some interesting work looking at native and non-native Phragmites in terms of their responses to elevated nitrogen in particular, and showing that when nitrogen levels increase, the invasive Phragmites can really take off and take advantage of that, whereas native Phragmites tends to sort of plod along doing its same thing and not being as opportunistic to increase nitrogen levels. So using collections from our populations around the state of native, hybrid, and invasive Phragmites, Janelle is growing them, evaluating their growth, and testing their responses to elevated nitrogen. So we can get a better handle on, sort of understanding the risk associated with hybridization and Phragmites. So she's collected these plants, multiple populations of each genotype, and she's doing what we call a common garden experiment, meaning all of the populations are grown under this same shared set of environmental conditions. So we can separate out environmental effects. And then she's subjecting them to either ambient or kind of control levels of nitrogen versus elevated nitrogen levels that we're seeing in our wetlands as a result of agriculture and other sources of eutrophication. And then she's comparing their performance in terms of their growth rates, height, and above and below ground biomass. So to wrap up, ways that you can help are, one, to use best practices to prevent spread of non-native Phragmites, report occurrences of non-native Phragmites to us. Julia is sort of the state clearinghouse of reports of non-native Phragmites and can help with identifications. And then also by increasing awareness and educating landowners and land managers. And we've certainly seen this in Minnesota, where lake associations and other citizen groups, notably around the Chisago Lakes area, have really driven a lot of the momentum and energy around Phragmites response efforts. Here is our contact information if you'd like to reach out to us about anything. And we have a lot of good resources on our website, minfrag.org, including identification guides, information about management, distribution maps, and other resources. And we want to acknowledge the funding for this work, which comes from MACERC and the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, and also from Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and Minnesota DNR. And we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan and Julia. As a reminder, everyone, if you have questions, please feel free to hit that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type those in. I'm just wondering, to kick things off, if you two could talk a little bit more about some of those locally led efforts, and how those came about, and sort of how those can serve as a blueprint for folks that are interested in doing the same kind of work against Phragmites.
I would say that the effort, for example, in the metropolitan area, led by Carrie Taylor and her counterparts in the other counties, that was pretty grassroots. I mean, they just realized that they had a problem, something they didn't want to get further established, and they sought funding from the MDA and began to coordinate with each other. And then that's something that I've just like been tapping into them now and then updating our records based on what they're working on. But that effort is solely driven by them. So their county ag agents and Soil and Water Conservation District and other county personnel. Somewhere like Chisago also, I think, they became aware of the invasive Phragmites out there, and there were a couple of leaders in the Lake Association, and they took the bull by the horns and led the effort. And they've just engaged, other members of the Lake Association, and they've been sought funding to do the work, and sought the contractor, put out the bids, and then they have been going out and actually getting volunteer groups that go out and do the mow downs in the wintertime to prep everything for the next year's treatment. So they've had a couple of years of that kind of effort. So a lot of it is really grassroots.
Then I guess another question for me is just how does our level of invasive Phragmites in Minnesota compare to some of the other states around us? Is this a bigger problem here? Are we seeing similar levels in some of the other Midwestern states?
Yeah, I would say I first started working on Phragmites when I was based in the Chicago area, and we're certainly have less Phragmites, fortunately, than some of our neighbors to the east, in Illinois and Wisconsin, Michigan, where they have many very large populations. And we are fortunate in that while we have this number that's unfortunately grown a lot, up to over 700 known patches, a lot of them are quite small. These can be little patches along roadsides, and a relatively small number of our populations are at that acre plus scale, where control becomes exceedingly difficult. So I would say it's a growing problem here. It's one that I think people like Julia, who have worked in natural resources in Minnesota for a number of years, have seen the spread over time and the increase. But we are, we have much less than a lot of places to the east. And in particular, parts of southern New England, the mid-Atlantic, it's really at the point where it can't be turned back, and where there's even some credible arguments that large-scale control efforts in some situations will do more harm than good at this point.
Great. And then a question that just came in. Can you speak to how non-native Phragmites are introduced to a new area? What's kind of the mode of spread that we're seeing right now?
I think one mode of spread that I am picking up on is mowing, roadside mowing. And the reason I say that is because we do have two staffers from MnDOT that literally just drive around and spot weeds and report them in ed maps. And so not just Phragmites, but anything that's on their list that they're supposed to be controlling. But the reports that are coming in from them in large part are very small little starter populations that are, they're new and very small, and they skip along the highway a little bit and there will be another one. And so I do think that mowing is one of the ways right now that we're seeing quite a bit of spread. I'm a little concerned that construction is another source, because we do tend to see it in a lot of stormwater ponds, and some of those are in kind of newly developed communities where those ponds are new. And so there might be a source where some equipment or some soil is bringing it in or something like that. But that is not very well understood, what might be the ultimate source of those populations.
And in general, in addition to those issues of kind of contamination, it can spread in water and it can spread through the air. And there's definitely a pattern of highways being major sources of spread. And part of that is probably mowing, like Julia said, and then also having all of this habitat that's really, Phragmites is really well suited to thrive in. Roadside ditches, with road salt, it's more salt tolerant than most of other wetland vegetation in the area. And so I've noticed this a lot in the Chicago area, where areas that probably, highway ditches that were cattail in the past are now, the cattail is being replaced by Phragmites, and then, the wind movement and water movement spreads it further. And then the, wastewater treatment facilities are undoubtedly have been a source of spread. When these were installed in the early 2000s, mostly, there was this idea that Phragmites didn't produce viable seed and couldn't spread by seed. And so there was what unfortunately turned out to be a false assumption that using non-native Phragmites in these facilities wouldn't be a source of spread. But we now know clearly that invasive Phragmites does produce viable seed. And if you think about what's happened with these facilities, is you have this species that's been introduced to new areas in these facilities, grown in these large reed beds where they've been fertilized and taken care of. And then, you through wind dispersal and other pathways out of those facilities, then you get these populations, these wild populations arising outside. So those wastewater treatment facilities have been kind of nodes across the landscape where you can have that new colonization.
Thanks. And I guess one question from me, there are a lot of kind of ongoing research projects that you talked about today. Of those, which are you two kind of the most curious or most excited to get results from? What are you really looking forward to finishing up?
Well, I personally am really excited about, getting the establishment of the native reeds in the beds, and then also exploring other wetland species. One of the reasons I think exploring other wetland species will be important, or could be important, is because the native Phragmites doesn't grow as densely. So there's just going to be less biomass in a reed bed even if we can use it there, which I think we will be able to. But I think it might be interesting to have a polyculture and to grow some of these other wetland species amongst the native reeds. So I'm particularly excited to see the results of growing these other wetland species, and partly because that's kind of my background too. But I think Dan is maybe I'll let you speak to what you're most excited about, Dan.
Yeah, I would say for me, it's, I really enjoy doing the research, but I think it's the potential we have for control and, kind of the partnerships that have arisen, us and the DNR working very closely together on the statewide effort, as well as other partners, and the potential to kind of, really have an impact on these populations. And it's, it's sort of moving in fits and starts. It's a complicated effort. There are a lot of different entities involved and permissions and sort of challenges in the implementation, but we're all learning a lot collectively as we go. And I think if we can keep this effort up over the coming years, there's you know, a real opportunity here to you know, we're beyond containment, it's around the state, but to reduce impact and try to stave off having some of the really extreme negative habitat impacts that have happened elsewhere, where there hasn't been, you know, sort of too late to really prevent those severe impacts.
Thanks, Dan and Julia. As a reminder, everyone, if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The first question I had for the two of you was kind of going back to that map of the hybrids. It seemed like there was kind of a cluster around the metro and then a pretty wide distribution across the state. Dan, do you have a sense how much of that is unique hybridization events versus how much is one hybrid population spreading to the surrounding area?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is genetic variation that we see within the hybrid. So I think it's from hybrids arising multiple times rather than just one initial event. And I think, you know, the metro areas where I expected the greatest likelihood that we would find hybrids. And indeed, that is sort of the higher density, but then you see these other points sort of scattered around. And one thing to keep in mind is this map here is not showing, this is showing the samples we submitted for analysis. It's not showing the full background of all of the Phragmites on the landscape. So some of these hybrids, you know, say up in north central Minnesota that look like they're orphaned in a sea without Phragmites, there actually is a sea of Phragmites underneath them. Yeah, and it'll be really interesting to see what Janelle's results are so we can kind of get at potential differences among the hybrids from population to population.
Great. Then the next question I had is just kind of about the history of invasive Phragmites. Why was it so favored for a lot of these wastewater treatment facilities versus some of our other native plants? Is it because it does so well in these eutrophic environments?
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, it's first of all just such a big plant. So if you were to, you know, look at plants that grow in wet, mucky conditions and think, okay, which one of these is going to be the most powerful straw as removing water? It makes sense because it is such a large, densely growing plant that produces a lot of biomass. And there's actually, you know, beyond the US, there's a history of using reeds elsewhere, in the UK, for example, elsewhere in Europe, of using reed beds for water treatment. And so I think from kind of a, you know, engineering perspective, it makes sense that people looked to Phragmites. What's unfortunate is when this was kind of rolled out and started being implemented in wastewater treatment facilities in Minnesota, Wisconsin, elsewhere, it was promoted as something that had very little risk or no risk of spread, because there was this idea that invasive Phragmites doesn't produce viable seed. And so the thought was, oh, we can have this kind of low-cost green technology and don't worry about us moving Phragmites around the country because it's not going to escape. And unfortunately, that's simply not true. And there's been a lot of work over the past 10 years showing that while the proportion of seeds that Phragmites produces, you know, there may be a low proportion that's viable, that really doesn't matter when so many thousands of seeds are being produced in a given patch.
And that actually leads into the next question we've got. We've got a couple kind of coming in response to that. For those treatment plants that are still reluctant to remove invasive Phragmites, is cost the main reason we're running into with that?
Yeah, I'd say it is. If they can transition just immediately to another plant that will be effective, I think they'd be happy to do that, but they're not sure that the native reed will be as effective. And some of them are operating on kind of a margin. Some of them have they were built at overcapacity, and so they are able to operate less efficiently as drying beds will be. Others are, closer to, their margins of operational efficiency. And if they get rid of their reeds, then they're concerned that they won't be able to operate and be as effective processing biosolids and storing biosolids. So it does come down to cost. They would have to find some other technologies to use. For example, Albertville is considering using a device that would squeeze the water out of the biosolids, and they'd store the biosolids out of the reed beds, but then they'd have to handle it more often. And every time you have to handle it and take it out either to a landfill or to a field site to land apply it costs money. And that would have to happen more often.
And there's some real, built infrastructure to deal with. This affected the design of these plants, the wastewater.
Dan, you just put yourself on mute.
Yeah. Affected how they were designed and constructed because they chose this technology. So in some cases, they could be looking at very large costs to switch over to more of a standard engineering solution, which is what most of, we're talking about a small percentage of statewide wastewater treatment facilities, of which there's, 200 something, if I'm remembering correctly.
And I would say too, they didn't all choose this technology of their own volition either. It was kind of, here's a great green technology that your municipality can afford, and this will be great for you. So there was a little bit of them being sold this technology, and now they're being asked to, move away from it.
All right, and then going back to the question of seeds, how long do those seeds remain viable, those that are viable from invasive Phragmites?
I have heard, but I have not seen a paper, and maybe Dan can speak to that they're only annually viable, but I don't know if there actually is any research on that or if that's just kind of hearsay.
Yeah, I'm also not sure if there's been much research in that to determine it.
And annually viable would mean that, this year's crop will drop, they could sprout, but then they won't live through, to survive in the seed bank. But we don't know that for sure.
Sounds like that might be a future grad project. How does the situation with Phragmites in Minnesota compare to some of the other Midwestern states or even other places in the US?
Yeah, I think we are fortunately not as far along in spread of invasive Phragmites as some of our neighbors. For example, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, other states around the Great Lakes have much more of the non-native Phragmites, and they have a lot more situations where there are these really large extents of it. So while we have a large number and unfortunately a growing number of populations around the state, many of these are really quite small, little patches along highways and that sort of thing. And we have a relatively low number of these acre plus infestations that are really difficult to control. So better off than some, but definitely a need for to be proactive so that so it doesn't get worse and sort of get out of hand to a level where we can't effectively control it.
All right, well, with that, I don't see any more questions coming in. If anybody has an additional question for Julia and Dan, feel free to type that into the Q&A section. But in the meantime, I will kind of give the logistics for the rest of the day. Our next talk here in room 4 is going to be from Mike Verhoeven and Dan Larkin on kind of the state of AIS removal and native vegetation recovery. If you're interested in attending that talk, feel free to just stay in this room. That will start up at 3:15. Otherwise, if you are looking to see what other talks are going to be in that last hour of concurrent sessions, I've just dropped the link for the agenda into the chat. You can just click that and that'll give you all the links to whichever web room you're looking to go to. I want to thank Dan and Julia for presenting. This was another really great presentation today. With that, our next session is going to start up at 3:15. So we will see you all then.
Great. Thank you, Pat. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.